So a trumpet and a synthesizer walk into a bar. And that's what you get, I think.
Somebody's having a sad day.
Yeah. Good morning. Welcome, all. It's very nice to have you with us. It is the 17th of May, 14 minutes past 9 o'clock on this Wednesday morning. It's a delight to have you with us on a day where there was, on my ride down, I had a little sunshine. I had a little rain, a little cloudy. So I got a little bit of everything. It was it was a full buffet of weather on my way down. Hopefully it's shining, sun is shining where you are, and if not, we can help provide those rays of sunshine to make it a better day. We welcome you to join us, panel at WAMC.org, panel at WAMC.org. Let me introduce the panel to you, and we will get started. We have a lot to talk about. WAMC's Alan Chartock. Good morning, Alan. How are you?
Well, good morning, Joe. I'm very well, ready to rock and roll.
Excellent. Good to hear your voice. Mark Wittman is here. Public, no. He is he's a Wall Street investment banker and our good friend. Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Morning, Joe. If you want the truth, I'm in a surly mood, but I promise to behave.
Okay, that's good.
It's better that way.
To be in a surly mood? Or?
Oh, yeah. It makes things interesting.
Well, our little ray of sunshine, Bob Griffin, is here, Dean of the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security and Cybersecurity at the University of Albany. And I think what we can prove today, yes, Bob, is the difference between surly and snarky.
I've never seen Mark as surly before. I am consistently snarky. I would be remiss if I didn't wish our Norwegian listeners a happy Independence Day today, Joe, and enjoy your farkle, which is cabbage and mutton.
Cabbage and mutton.
Yes.
Lovely.
Do they have? Do they do fireworks?
Yes.
Yes, Joe. That's how they get the mutton.
Somewhere in Norway, fireworks. That's a good bet. Right?
That's right. That's true. They're going to blow something up. And truly, our ray of sunshine is Theresa Bourgeois, who is public policy and communications expert, and is a communications and public policy expert, and joins us this morning. Good morning, Theresa.
So delighted to be here.
Really nice to have you.
And I knew Bob was going to be here, so I had to look up what days it was.
Yes.
And among other things, it's National Bike to School Day. And I saw this great program they have in a couple of places around the country where teachers and others lead kids to bike to school to get kids out moving again.
Yeah.
And just whole, 30, 40 kids at a time. It started out as a little project in one city, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And and then it's also National Cherry Cobbler Day, so you could bike to school.
Have a
and
little
then have
cobbler.
a little cobbler.
And if you're Norwegian, it's just a trifecta.
It's a perfect day.
Yeah, it's no issues at all.
But biking to school, that's the thing to do.
Which may explain the frost tonight, too.
In any case, let's focus on the sunshine.
All right. Well, we will try, and that's you do that very well.
That'll end soon, though.
Yeah, that'll. Good morning, everyone. Welcome again. You can join us, panel at WAMC.org, panel at WAMC.org. Let me get to the letters and not to the letters, to our first topic, and then we'll introduce your letters in just a moment. So negotiators yesterday say they're seeing progress on the debt ceiling. And now, who's upset? Well, Biden's liberal allies. Those are the people who are worrying at the moment. This is a roulette wheel of worry, often, of who is upset and mad at any given moment. But in this case, President Biden and top congressional leaders expressed optimism about urgent negotiations over the debt ceiling after a meeting at the White House on Tuesday, as the administration's liberal allies worried that the talks with House Republicans over the budget risk rewarding the GOP's hard-line stance. House Republican Kevin McCarthy sounded confident that an agreement could be reached ahead of a June 1st deadline to raise the nation's borrowing limit or risk a global economic catastrophe. That's 2.5 weeks away, by the way. Biden gave a similar assessment though major differences remain between the two sides before a real deal can be struck. White House officials also announced that Biden will be cutting short a visit to Asia as the administration seeks to finalize an agreement. Aides to McCarthy and Biden will negotiate directly, according to lawmakers. Aides to McCarthy and Biden, I just said that, slimming down the number of parties involved in the talks as the deadline nears. The White House said staff would continue meeting daily, adding that Biden will check in with leaders by phone during his trip this week and in person when he returns. Mark Wittman.
Actually, Joe, I take some comfort in the situation that you described. The fact that the negotiating parties have been slimmed down tells you that they're making progress and getting real. The fact that Biden's coming back, I think, is a good sign. I know we're just talking in the lead up to getting on air. Some others have expressed concern about that. I'll let them do that themselves. I thought about, it's too bad he's got to go back out to Australia, but domestic priorities should be his priority. The fact that our real budget negotiations now tend to happen around this default threat is unfortunate, but if that's what we're doing politically, I think that's most important. And if the president believes that Australia is worth a trip, as I believe he should because of the importance of it as a counterbalance to China and Asia Pacific, he'll have to make another visit. In the article that you read, there was some hewing and crying from the left flank, as it was called, about the prospect of work requirements attached to government programs. I understand the sensitivity around that. I must also say, and here comes the surly mood, when the best quote the Washington Post can find is from Elizabeth Warren complaining, you're probably doing the right thing, in my mind. I just sometimes her overreactions to these issues are a bit much. If you look back, the last time that in the 2006 era where we put work requirements on welfare, it actually worked out as a general proposition for the country. Now, it was during strong economic times, so there was a tailwind, but we've got that now. That is not to, so I think some of this sort of theoretical concern is overblown if you look at history. Those requirements brought the number of welfare families, the caseload down from 5 million to 2 million. It brought up the employment rate amongst those on welfare and brought up their incomes. Now, when you do something like that, you've got to be careful, right? You have to protect particularly children who are part of families where the adults are sort of mildly disabled, emotionally disturbed, or on drugs. You've got to put in a platform for that. You have to make sure that you continue to uplift the wages and earning potential of the working poor. And you've got to continue to put programs in place that entice particularly young men and young women to stay in school before they start to form families, or once they form families to still stay in school. So you can't do these things sort of unsympathetically, but the fact that we're looking to do them, I think the left's initial reaction, I think, is overblown.
Bob.
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot to unpack, but it does sound like there is sort of the typical movement towards, and I say typical because this sort of game of chicken that we've been talking about literally for months now about the debt limit. I do think, and I do want to go back to the question, Theresa, that you raised, and Mark, that you just raised about some of the international aspects of cutting the trip short. However, the domestic and the debt limit, I think, is a big enough priority. I wonder, though, as in typical times, you say the negotiations, as they shrink, that means that it's getting closer, that the deal is that's coming due. I just wonder if that still holds true with this current Congress, given how fractious it's been, and whether whether McCarthy's going to really be able to whip enough votes if it's a close issue. So I think that plays another interesting role in it. One of the takeaways that I was thinking about, if, as Mark you pointed out, if the debt limit now becomes a second bite at party's ability who have lost a party position or policy position because of budgets and votes, it gives them an ability to go back and undo some of that. Then I think the Democrats need to start to embrace that, and they're going to have to think about how to play chicken with the debt limits as well as the Republicans have. They passed 3 clean debt limit votes under the Trump administration, and I look at what's being put on the table right now, and I think, well, at its face, if you put safeguards in on things like work requirements, okay, I understand how that would play. My concern is that we've seen a party that has been unwilling to put safeguard limits on a lot of the policy positions that they've taken. So I do wonder where the line is there, and with a much smaller group, when they come out with an announced package, it's kind of baked, and then the question becomes a yes or no vote, and it's going to be interesting to see how that is actually pushed through. Couple quick comments, and then I'll turn it over to Theresa and Alan. The president needs to prioritize getting back to both Australia and to the Papua New Guinea and some of and meet with some of the leaders that we are not going to be meeting with right now. Anything that we can do to help with to counterbalance the expansion of Chinese influence into those both territorial areas and waters is critically important, and we can't. We sent a very bad message. I saw a couple of very interesting articles about, well, this is typical U.S. policy, that we just aren't important, and the time is coming where we're going to need every ally that we can get, and especially in that neck of the woods. So understand why the president's coming back. I just hope that they will turn that plane around relatively quickly, and he will go back and do some damage control, and we can continue to try to deal with the other major concerns, and that includes our own safety and security.
Theresa Bourgeois.
I think that the potential damage that McCarthy and his group are doing to our country domestically and globally is just really deeply concerning to me. I think we have to step back, big picture, and just remind ourselves that this is not regular order. I mean, the way the budget should be developed is with a lot of back and forth, but through the budget committees, through the House House committee process, through the Senate committee process. And of course, that sounds all very wonky, but that's how you air out all these issues. And you end up with something that is ultimately a compromise. In the end, the last bits are jammed through, but it has gone through a subcommittee and a full committee review process on both sides, and everybody has to work together, and the numbers get shooken out, and that's typically how it happens. Now, you have the problem with McCarthy in that he knows he can't put a real budget proposal on the table because his conference is so divided that he couldn't bring them together. He couldn't put something on the table. And so what he has done to try to deal with his internal power structure problem or lack of continuity within his own conference. I know this is incredibly wonky, but because he couldn't figure that out, he is roiling the global markets. It's resulted in disrupting some very important meetings that were supposed to happen over the next 2 weeks. This is a really dangerous precedent and process problem. And so just the big picture of, yes, you need to have these budget fights, but you shouldn't be happy that it's ending up with 2 people in a room. I mean, that's what he really wants, because he wants to bypass the fact that he can't figure out in his own house and do it the right way. Separately, what you're looking at, if you look at this problem that we have, the June 1st problem, could be solved in a minute if you just let the House use the discharge petition. I know, terribly arcane, but it allows them to to pull a proposal out of the committee and onto the floor, and you have Democrats vote for it and some group of Republicans, and let McCarthy look the other way, right? And then you could get it through the House, and then it would quickly go through the Senate. You would pass it. The retirees won't lose money on the deep dive in the markets. It will inevitably happen, and their savings are going to be hurt, and businesses won't be hurt, and whatever. You could do that, and then you could move on to this very rancorous budget debate, doing it in the regular process. But no, that's not where we're going. I think McCarthy's change in tone, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that business letter. How many people, leading business people from all over the country signed a letter and said, this is dangerous, get it done. And my guess is was this change in tone, because what he was saying wasn't much different. We're not close together. But what shifted is him saying, I think we could get something done. But if you look at the substance of what he's doing...
Can I pause you there?
Because I'm talking too much.
No, you're all right. We just have a break. So when I come back, I'm going to say, so about the substance.
Yeah, I want to see what these guys think about the substance.
All right. Well, let's do that. We'll have rehearsal during the break, and when we come back, we'll actually do it for real.
Leave it for the show, Joe.
That's right. We'll be right back. We'll take a news break, and when we return, we'll talk about other things right after this. Good morning. Welcome to the Roundtable and to our panel discussion and our great group this morning, Alan Chartock, Theresa Bourgeois, Bob Griffin, and Mark Wittman. And we wanted to talk to you about substance, right?
Right.
Was that the key word?
Right. So he wants to negotiate the budget outside the budget process, McCarthy, and what they passed. And the way he got it passed was by saying to his members, don't worry, this is never going to get signed into law. So then they held their nose and passed it. But one of the things he wants to do is cap the budget increases at 1%, but no details on how he's going to do that, right? So how does that math work, Mark? How's that? I mean, that math doesn't work. That means either 1% across the board, or if you take defense out, which they're going to do, and you take entitlements out, which they'll probably do, that means 50, 51, 52% cuts in all EPA, education, health and human services. How does that math work?
Oh, the answer, Theresa, I actually think your observation is right, which is what the Democrats proffered was not a budget. It was a list of demands.
What the Republicans proffered.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. What McCarthy and the Republicans proffered was not a budget. It was a list of hostage demands. It might as well have been from little cutout pieces of newspaper, letter by letter, like a hostage letter. Because that's all it was. It wasn't a
coherent... I don't know that it wasn't.
It was. Yeah, it might have been. It would have been appropriate. So let me just back up half a step. The best chance to avoid this was during the lame duck session. President, I know the Congress, Biden failed. So and the Republicans are irresponsible. We should not be playing on this ledge, but we are. So we need to come up with a compromise and get off the ledge. And if you look at historically, the stock market falls about 6.5% in the weeks leading up to one of these imbroglios. I think the cost to Americans in terms of the degradation of the faith and credit of the American financial trust and financial system is even greater.
Right.
And I think it's permanent, at least until the market forgets it, which may be a long time if we keep doing this on an ongoing basis. And that's not to say that there's going to be another world currency. It's just going to say that the degree of our preeminence and the efficiency with which we borrow will decrease. It will become more expensive if we keep playing these stunts. But on to the specifics. The Republican list of demands to get the hostage back was an initial list, and it looks like they're paring it down. And this is the wrong context. But this country needs to get its fiscal house in order. If I may, I believe it was Fareed Zakaria who said, and he probably was quoting somebody else, so I should be careful. But he said, Americans love Democratic spending and Republican taxation. The problem is we can't get a budget that meets in the middle of those two, and we as a country need to work it out. Unfortunately, this is where we've decided to have the fight, but so be it. Let's start getting our fiscal house in order.
But the history, if you look at them, the historic charts of who has exploded the debt and who has contained it. It's the Democrats who've contained it, and the Republicans have exploded the debt because they focus on these tax breaks that don't benefit average Americans, right?
I agree. I agree
they
entirely.
Historically, and what Biden has done, in spite of having, still dealing with the COVID problem, he has brought down the deficits, right? They've started to come down. If you look at the charts, they're coming down. Now, they're not coming down as fast as they need to, but they are coming down. But even look at one of the proposals in here is, quote unquote, claw back the unspent COVID relief money. Oh, that sounds great, right? There's whatever, $70 billion in unspent. Well, actually go look at the details of that. That's already baked in the numbers of the economists. I've read it in 4 or 5 different places, so they were already planning on that. And B, that's money, it's not been spent yet, but it's intended to be spent for all sorts of reasons that the country needs. So, for instance, I know firsthand experience. Our senior center, you need to improve the air ventilation system so that if this ever happens again. Didn't get the money in the first round, maybe you'd get the money in the second round. Should that be clawed back? Right? Or relief for state and local governments, or a whole host of things. This money was to be spent over 10 years, was intentional, and clawing it back is not going to have the intended purpose. I think that of affecting the debt limit numbers at all, because it was already calculated in. There's a whole host of these. The rescind key programs in the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, they couldn't stop it in the beginning, and so they're trying to stop it now. That's not, the key climate change, infrastructure, right? These are policy things that they want to dismantle the Biden agenda. Biden, despite what everybody says, he's had an incredibly successful legislative agenda. And it will grow the economy. It will deal with climate. That's very expensive if you don't deal with it. Yet they want to dismantle it.
And I think this is what bothers me about what both of you have just said is by having this type of discussion, you called it hostage taking. You were talking about policy. It's really giving McCarthy almost a line item veto to be able to go back in and identify things that had been negotiated as part of the compromise in the budget process or as part of the policy documentation to target things that they don't like. And that's exactly what's happening right now, which is part of my heartburn is that this is not the way it's supposed to go. I get the fact that we're dancing on the ledge and dance, but this also goes back to my other comment that in the future, I don't think that Democrats can just do a clean bill the way they have in the past. If this is the way you make substantive policy corrections or pivots, then they're going to have to use this tool, which means that this is going to be more and more an important part of policy considerations. In some respects, maybe even more so important than the budget considerations because it's easier to pinpoint what you don't like. And think about just the terminology that we're using. Because if you're just sort of sitting back thinking, okay, I don't really follow a lot of this, but clawback. Oh, well, that sounds good. That sounds like we're getting our money back from people who are abusing it. The idea that once again we're pushing the welfare cheat out there and we're pushing people on welfare to have to go work, that in the back of your mind it's like, well, it's because those people are stealing our money. I mean, it's there's a number of tropes that have worked really, really well for the Republicans for frankly generations now, back to Reagan and earlier, that are linked with this.
And they piled them in here, put a bow on it, and said that they're doing great things. But if you look at the substance, of saying the work requirement. It costs more to do it than it does to implement it. And that data, the other half of the data that you didn't talk about is the rapid rise in poverty. Right? And so, but look at there's a provision in there. I mean, this is way down in the weeds, but there's a provision in there about regulatory authority that says if you pass the regulation and then it goes into the agency, EPA, whoever, and then they decide how it's going to be implemented. Well, now a provision in there says, well, then you have to go back to the Congress and have a vote on whether or not they propose to implement it properly. That just stops it. Permitting reform. Oh, that sounds good. Permitting reform, right? What it does is say that for infrastructure projects, and it's a way to, what they really want to do is accelerate leasing of, gas and fossil fuel energy projects, right?
It's also interesting, and if you get your thoughts on this too, is it's actually three people in the room. It's McConnell, it's McCarthy, and it's Biden, which I found it really interesting that Schumer and Jeffries were not part of that, and I just tossed that out as a conversation piece.
Yeah. So let's talk about, first of all, Theresa, I understand that the initial list of hostage demands had in it some very unreasonable components, including what you mentioned around the change in presumption around regulation. That it once now my expectation is that won't be in what's final. That they're not going to get that list. They're going to get some elements of that list. So unless and until we know that's imminent, let's leave that. Let's agree that it's a bad thing, and let's talk about some of the things that look more likely to survive. The clawback, as I understand it, are funds that are not yet committed. So nobody's been promised these funds. We know everybody agrees we overspent during COVID. So the fact that as a general proposition we're thinking about taking some of that money off the table doesn't. I'm sure there are always examples of where, we probably should spend the extra money here. But as a general proposition, it doesn't sound, so unreasonable. And let's talk about the what was it called? The Inflation Reduction Act. Right. Some panelists in this room on the day it was passed said the problem with these things is they get far more expensive on the spending side and far less effective on the taxing side. Well, guess what's happened? Initially, the government had an estimate of $400 billion for subsidies for purchases of electric vehicles. That subsidy, because it was uncapped, and because of the new set of projections, is now estimated to be over $1.1 trillion. So the fact that Republicans or anyone are raising their hand and saying, wait a second, we thought we were passing something that was about $400 billion, and now it's multiples of that. I think it's entirely, it shouldn't be under these circumstances, Bob, that we're revisiting this. But as long as we're going to have a fight about revenue and spending, let's have a discussion about something like that.
But the key thing you just said was it shouldn't be under these circumstances. These kinds of policy questions have to be discussed, but they have to be discussed with everybody, including, Senator Schumer, including the House Democrats. There's a process through which you do this, and if you have to tinker or amend things, there's a process. But this is not that process. I know it sounds ridiculously wonky, but this is not the place to do that. And when you do, then you create this uncertainty in the U.S. markets and in the global markets. Businesses, better than I, they shift what their plans are because they have to anticipate what if these folks do go over the edge, right? They have to be prepared for that. You're going into a G7 meeting and with a weak hand because these countries now have to say, are you going to destabilize our economies by not doing this, right? It changes the dynamic in an extremely dangerous and long-term costly way. It's reckless.
You're conflating two issues. And back to Bob's point. Bob said, I think the Democrats should start taking hostages. What I would propose is that the Democrats should... The Democrats, next time they're in hostage-taking mood, should say, "Hey, look, we're maybe it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now. We're going to take the debt ceiling out of the calculation once and forever for both sides."
Perfect.
That's a better proposal.
That's what has to happen.
So,
that's the problem here.
Just two things though. So let's agree we shouldn't be fighting on the ledge, okay? But
on
now
this ledge,
on any ledge. I mean, this is stupid. But unfortunately, it's the ledge that the Republicans saw as available to them. The Democrats were unable to take it off the table during the lame duck session, and here we are. So agreeing that the ledge is a bad place to have these fights, but you wanted
I say the
moments ago-
Democrats,
hold on,
the
hold on.
Democrats and Republicans didn't take it off the table. There were responsible Republicans who could have stepped in and helped take it off the table in the lame duck and they did not.
Sure, and I
so
bet
it's
you-
not just the Democrats; it's the Democrats and Republicans. McConnell knows better. There's Republicans who know better. They know how dangerous this is to the U.S. and global economy, and they did not
Yeah.
act.
Your
That's
red
fair.
light is blinking, Mark. That gives you the green light. Go ahead.
No, I that's a fair point. That to say, the Democrats failed to do it. They failed to capitalize on what seemed like an advantage to them, but may not have been given the
Both sides failed.
underlying head counts, and both parties are responsible. That's fair. But I do think when and I think frankly some on the left do this when you talk about some of the reasonable things that the Republicans are asking to look at. Given the fact that we have a big budget problem in this country, a big one, a generation from now. People are going to look around at the United States, at a country that used to spend about $1.6 for every dollar it took in on an annual basis, and they're going to have to pay the debt down, which may be, if it continues, they may have to actually add a digit to that debt clock in Midtown Manhattan in terms of how bad this is going to get if we don't stop our profligate spending. And that generation is going to say, hey, the government used to pass out $1.05, roughly $1.03 to $1.05 for every dollar it took in. And now I'm only getting 95 cents because we have to pay it down. I mean, there's a whole generation that's going to say, where the heck did the money go? And it's going to be our responsibility. So we need to stop this nonsense now, and we might as well have the fight.
Well, let's stop this nonsense just for a moment. We'll pause, and we'll take a break, and we'll come back. We have some letters. We'll have much more discussion. Panel at WAMC.org. Panel at WAMC.org. We'll be right back. Good morning. Welcome back to the Roundtable and to our panel discussion. We are talking about the debt ceiling, and the question is progress being made? If so, what progress, and where will we end up? Having a spirited conversation this morning. We would love for you to be a part of it. Panel at WAMC.org. Anything you would?
Yeah, there's just a couple of thoughts. One, I mean, again, even in this conversation, we're conflating the debt limit and paying for debt versus the budget, and I think that's one thing. What we're talking about with the debt limit is paying for money that has already been obligated. Okay, so this gets lost. So people think, if we cut the budget, then that's going to, it plays a role. But in reality, we're talking about money that we have already spent. Right. And the other thing that I think is really dangerous about sort of the subcompartmentalization that we're seeing is that it takes whole swaths of the spending that we do as a country, including the military, including entitlements, and instead what it does is it focuses and leaves a much, much smaller pie. Things like education and infrastructure and social safety nets, which pretty much exempts a lot of the big players. And if we are going to become fiscally responsible, Mark, the way you advocated, and I think you are correct in saying, you have to have conversations about the military, and you have to have conversations about entitlements, and there just isn't the political willingness. I'll also note that, and this gets into potentially another article we can talk about Manchin in West Virginia. He's angry about the electric car issue. He thought the bill was for commercial electric cars, and the Treasury Department said the way the bill was written, it was open to everything, which is in part why it ballooned, which gets back to one of my bugaboos is the fact that you're not doing your job, Congress. Write the bills. If you wanted it to say specifically commercial vehicles, then it should have been in the bill. And this is a real problem that Congress leaves open-ended legislation, which can then be interpreted, and that's creating gaps between what the intent and purpose is versus what the letter of the law is.
Yeah. Bob, on the CBOE issue, on the $400 million versus $1.1 trillion, I mean, the CBOE gave an estimate. That estimate was predicated on the same assumption that Manchin had. So they were.
That's Congressional Budget Office estimate?
Yes, thank you. And so, there was a little legerdemain going on.
But that's not what the bill said, though.
That's not what the bill said.
Well, that's not how the bill's been interpreted. I haven't read the bill, so I don't know what it says. But once somebody says, hey, that thing that we told you was $400 billion is now $1.1 trillion and rising, I don't think it's irresponsible to say, hey, let's talk about that again.
I don't either, but this idea of running around all of a sudden like, oh my goodness, it's somebody else is screwing it. And this is also the role of the courts. If Manchin thinks that the bill is not being implemented correctly, go through the court system. This is what the balance of power is for.
But Manchin is worried about his reelection.
Oh, there's no doubt. He
got played by the rest of the Democrats. He looks bad in West Virginia, and he needs to fix it.
It's all about his election.
And as a sort of a liminal individual who can hold out his vote, he's got the ability to put the spotlight back on him and get a win for his state, and that's what we're seeing happening. And by the way, I entirely agree that when you have the fight the way we're having it, on the ledge, I think it's a very astute observation to focus in on the fact that you all of a sudden have to save money in specific ways, not more broadly from defense and other areas.
Alan, what do you think? All right. Anything else, Theresa? I'm going to go to some letters.
I also...
I was just saying, I'm listening with great fascination.
I can't hear.
I can't hear you, Alan.
Too bad. Now?
There we go.
There you go.
Oh, good. Well, I think there's a great deal of sense being made here, but I do think that a lot of this, I heard the word legerdemain a little earlier, and I do think that an awful lot of people are relying on magic to sort of get us through this.
Right. I mean, that's the interesting thing is how you thread this needle. But I do agree with you, Bob. Absolutely. I mean, I'm neurotic about it. Is that you have to have this conversation
I would say
separately.
passionate. I don't know if I'd go with neurotic.
No, I'm a little.
I like you. You're not
No, I just think this is just such a dangerous path to travel down. But I also, Mark, I mean, let's be clear, the Democrats are not the big spenders and the Republicans the big savers. I know that that's what the Republicans try to create, but on the revenue side, they bust the budget all the time. And, and that's a real problem. But the key thing is these are all important debates to be having, but not on the back of raising the debt limit. Raise the debt limit separately, have all of these debates separately in the budget process.
By the way, I think the only Republican administration that didn't significantly accelerate the deficit was our friend G.W. Bush. Right. And that was because he broke the new taxes pledge as a Republican, and look how that worked out for him. So I don't disagree with your assessment of sort of who's at fault in terms of more at fault, but as we talked about earlier as to the missed opportunity to get rid of the debt ceiling this time around, it's a pox on both their houses. Yes. The fact that the Republicans are screaming up and down saying we need to save some money in the budget, I think we ought to take them up on that, and then I think as a country we need to turn to additional sources of revenue as well.
But if you want to get the economy, I mean, one of the things that is in this Republican package is to claw back or cut the funding for the IRS, right? And clearly the IRS, the funding for the lower income taxpayers is to try to make it an easier process, the IRS an easier process for them, and for those who are not paying their taxes at the higher end to try to get them to pay their taxes. I was looking at the pharmaceutical companies and what are their average rates? Like they pay 8% or something, and that's not right. And then they ship overseas, even though they get all sorts of subsidies for the work that they do. Letters, I'm sorry.
Teresa, I don't disagree with you on the tax issue. The interesting thing is if you look at who, and a reader, I got to give credit, a letter writer wrote in, and I did a little work around this. Actually, the people get flagged for most of the tax violations tend to be at the lower income levels because they participate in some of the income aid programs and they don't account for them properly and they get tagged. So it's interesting just to talk about when the Republicans don't want more IRS agents because of the sort of the Ruby Ridge, IRS agents with guns type of politics, but the reality is it's a smart investment, and the further reality is it actually leads to more careful scrutiny of tax returns at the lower income levels than above. But despite all those political machinations, you're right. It's still stupid to be cutting funding for the IRS.
All right,
Do they know that? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, the Republicans know, but they know the politics too, and that's what trumps all their considerations here.
It's easier to get rid of the ethics committee than it is to be ethical. That's all. just.
It's a good point. All right, I want to get to a couple of letters, and we'll take a break in a few moments because we have the top of the hour and we want to get over to Ray and news. So we go to, and we have a lot of them, but we go to Stephen, who says, to say that Americans want Republican taxation is completely inaccurate. What we really want is for large corporations and the rich to start paying their fair share, and subsidies for the undeserving corporations to end. That is from Stephen. Then there's this letter from Erica. To anyone who doesn't understand how welfare works, I'll give an example. I was a single mother receiving $413 per month while working 2 jobs. Then I got a third job. I had to notify the SNAP office within 10 days of my new job. As a result, it was cut down to $16 per month in benefits. The problem with the entire system is the fact that when you get any job and try to make more money to get ahead, welfare takes away benefits immediately. I am back on my feet within 10 days of getting that new job, nor does the money for that job go to only my food expense. You should be weaned off government assistance. Otherwise, you will always be behind. It's not worth getting another job to lose all your benefits.
Right.
That.
Well, and kudos for your work ethic and everything you're going through.
Thank you for writing.
Maybe we should put a work requirement in for the rich when they get their big tax break.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. The letter writer points out an important point, which is if there are misincentives in the system, they need to be ironed out.
American went into debt in 1790 to pay for the Revolution, writes Joel. The only year America was without debt was 1837. Is that true? Okay.
It's probably right before the Louisiana Purchase, which put us in again.
It's 2023 and America is in debt. It's normal, says Joel.
But it's too high.
Yeah, look, we're at levels of debt that the effect of which is going to become corrosive on this economy and its productivity. I don't disagree that debt's a good thing in terms of running a country like the size of America. I don't even think that the current level of debt is even such an issue. Doesn't seem to be. The problem is the way we're headed with structural deficits every year is going to lead to a level of debt that's going to denigrate the level of productivity in this country. That's the issue.
We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll continue. We have much more to discuss. We'll have letters on this issue, and we'll also move on to other topics. Panel at WAMC.org, Alan Chartock, Theresa Bourgeois, Bob Griffin, and Mark Wittman. You're listening to the Roundtable on WAMC. Good morning. Welcome back to the Roundtable and to our panel discussion for this Wednesday morning. It is the 17th of May, 7 minutes past 10 o'clock. Alan Chartock, Bob Griffin, Theresa Bourgeois, and Mark Wittman making up the panel. We welcome you, panel at WAMC.org. We have a lot of letters on what we've been discussing, which is the debt ceiling and the various proposals to take care of the problem. Jared writes, let this sink in. Corporations are currently writing off business lunches as legitimate tax-deductible expenses while they lobby Republicans to cut Medicare and Social Security. Then we go to Jay, who says, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I hear Mark say that subsequent generations will ask where my money went, I believe many think the money is and will continue to be going to the ultra-rich who continue to benefit from the Republican subservience. It seems like the Republicans are their servants and beholden to them. Then, you want to comment on that, Mark? You don't have to.
I don't. The letter writer implies that part of the problem is a disequilibrium in wealth distribution in this country, and they're right. But that's not the only fiscal challenge we face in this country. And that's not the only thing we need to do to get our spending house in order.
But there's not enough focus on that side of the ledger, though.
Well, there's almost no focus currently, right, and there needs to be a lot more focus. And I have bad news for people in this country. If you want to get to the level of social safety net that we probably all would aspire to if we didn't have to pay for it, it look more European than it would like America, And in order to do that, you got to put something like a VAT tax in place, which is pretty substantial.
But the letter writer does put their finger on, I think, an interesting, an important issue that we continue to need to be aware of, and that's the breakdown in this idea of the generational compact.
Right.
And the feeling that I get from my own kids and from the students is that they look at it and they go, there isn't going to be money for us. We pay into Medicare and Social Security and FICA and all that, but we're not going to get any of it. I mean, so there really is, at a fundamental level, I think a major distrust between the generations that is important to keep talking about.
Yeah, can I on this point of I'd call them entitlements, except if Libby were here, she'd shoot me. But these social programs.
Well, no, she'd stab you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. She doesn't believe in gun.
That's
right. I say that respectfully, of course. Look, some of why we're in that problem is good news. We have people who are living a lot longer than we ever thought we would live, as a populace. In addition to that, we have medical remedies available to us, although expensive, that significantly improve the quality of life and extend the term of life. So the problem of some of the added expense of these social safety nets, is actually sort of, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for a lot of good news. Yeah. But now that we have people living longer and we have more medical care available to them, we have to figure out how to pay for it reasonably. Now, the good news is it's not going to be zero for future generations. But in order to not break the system, we're going to have to tax more and give people less benefits. And exactly how we work that out needs to be worked out through the political process. But that's the only way the math is going to work.
Well, what makes you so sure that we can't just tax more, period?
Well, we're going to have to tax as part of it, but we'll also have to curtail benefits. I should, Alan, mention that the other short-term solution to the problem is to dramatically change the demographics in this country, but I don't think the Republicans are going to go for a substantial increase in the number of immigrants. The good news is, again, it's another good news part of this problem is we are a very unique country in terms of our ability and willingness to accept immigrants. Now, we obviously argue about exactly how many, when, and who, but the good news is we have a valve available to us to sort of help with our economic health over the intermediate and longer term that, for instance, China, Japan effectively doesn't have.
Japan's a really good example of that right now. They're at a really crisis point as far as the number of births, and you start to think about the number of young that they have to take over for the older generations. And boy, you put your finger on a huge issue, is that we need an influx of younger workers, and since our birth rates are down, immigration is an alternative. And what's nice about the country is that people do want to be here.
And who are allowed to work legally, paying into Social Security system.
Paying taxes.
And all the data shows that they're going to pay in more than they're going to get over time. And so that's absolutely true. But the other one, you're talking about a generational focus, is, what a couple generations now are going to say about us is what investments did we make to address the issue of climate change. And permitting review, right, is a way to say accelerate fossil fuels, right? And so short-term, quote-unquote, permit review, it sounds very lovely, is accelerating the, oil and gas, as opposed to, why isn't Manchin focused on helping his state, West Virginia, make the transition to be leaders in the clean economy, right? He could be doing that.
Why isn't
but
he?
He's not. Because I don't know.
Well, he's got investments in coal, but I have news about the permitting review. To answer the Manchin question, he actually has personal investments in coal. So that's one reason he may not be, frankly. Which I think is, by the way, it's despicable that that's permitted in Congress, but whole nother issue. On the permitting review, I have bad news. My view is I don't think it really matters what we do now, because you know what's going to happen? The next time we have another energy crisis in this country as we transition to greener fuels, and we will have another energy crisis, we're going to do the same thing we did if it lasts any longer than the last one. We're going to start the drill, baby, drill call again. Yeah. So I think we got to be really careful, because last summer, everybody in this room was like, oh, my God, gas prices are so high. Let's get more gas from somewhere. Well, the news is if you want it, then you're going to have to drill for it, because we ain't getting off oil for decades from now. If you remember, one of the best joke lines from Biden's State of the Union address is, we're going to be dependent on oil for at least another 10 years. I mean, it's a lot longer than that. So I got bad news on permitting.
But you have to make the transition, and you want the manufacturing to come back to the U.S. You want solar panels. You want wind blades. You want to have a workforce that's trained and that's benefiting from the transition. You want the gadgets to be made here. You want the innovations to come out of the U.S. And that requires investments. And it requires a steady stream of investments. We lost the solar industry for how many years? 20 years, whatever. But one of the things that the Biden administration is trying to do is bring it back, reshore it, and have the new innovations in the solar industry, which we need. We need to strengthen, the whole... anyway.
Well, there's two issues in there I'd like to address. Number one is,
I do want to get to letters, but go ahead.
You got to be careful about how these transitions work, because otherwise you end up like Germany, where because they shut down nuclear plants, they're now burning coal. So you do have to do it in a sensible way, and sensible permitting is part of that. And number two, the protectionism built into the Biden green energy plans, it helps American workers nominally, but it doesn't help green this world anymore. I mean, if you want a greener world, then you ought to drop the protectionism programs within the Biden industrial policy.
Jonathan writes, I wish I had an hour to explain to Mark Wittman why he is so wrong about our fiscal house being out of order. The debt is not a problem. The debt isn't even a debt. The debt is a non-governmental sector surplus, which helps all of us. It gives us businesses, roads, education, employment. Your listeners should not be listening to Mark on this. All right. Mark would disagree, as would we. Okay. Jill says Republicans always manage to find ways of getting Democrats to fold, and Democrats always seem to play nice. For example, could Democrats have held the debt ceiling hostage to prevent or get back the Trump tax cuts? I wish Democrats would get Republicans to experience their own dirty tactics. Then on Republican strategy, Holly writes, I believe the Republican strategy in this whole debt ceiling thing is to get Democrats to betray their values in the eyes of their constituents by submitting to these draconian cuts. Then they will campaign on how we don't keep our promises.
Yeah, you see, and I understand that logic, but honestly, I think the game in D.C. right now is either owning the libs or owning the maggots, and it's become a game that members of Congress will actually do things that hurt their own constituents in order to play the game.
We have this letter from Leonard. All work requirements do is make life a lot harder for people who are already having strife in their lives. There are more recent examples of states implementing work requirements to no benefits to the state, just more needless spending. This is nothing more than right-wing nuttery. Then we go to a letter from Beth. I know some people who are on welfare because they have children with medical needs that force them to be on Medicaid. They are people who want to work, but if they take a low-paying job, often the only thing they're qualified to do, they don't earn enough to also pay for health insurance, even with the Affordable Care Act. Until we have universal health care, this will continue to be a problem. People will say we can't afford it. However, has anyone ever looked at the taxes that would be generated allowing people to work without harming their and their children's health? Then we go to Jim. Forget about who is getting what here. Does it sound to anyone that Biden is functioning in a feeble manner, traveling to Japan, keeping in touch by phone, coming back early? You do that and have anything left in the tank. I mean, sounds like Biden can walk and chew gum at the same time. His predecessor, I would point out, would have handled this from the golf course. Then, let's see. I think that two more. Deb says, can you please address how the wealthy paid marginal tax rates up to over 70% for more than a century, including during the Greatest Generation? And since Reagan reduced taxes on the wealthiest, and with Trump's most recent tax breaks for the wealthy, revenue has dropped dramatically. Tax cuts on equitable marginal rates has cut revenue by trillions and gotten the wealthiest richer. cutting programs that improve quality of life for the majority is not the way. We must tax the rich. Then we go to Ruth, who says, regarding the letter who talked about losing benefits as soon as she was able to get another or better job, I know an employer in town who wanted to add hours for a very good employee, and she wouldn't take them because she would lose more in benefits, not just SNAP. There is rent support, etc. She would not have been rewarded for working more. In fact, she and her children would have been punished. There is something very wrong with this equation. Linda writes, why don't we, the country, talk about the military budget and associated costs? We direct so much money to the military, there's not enough left to address our social and infrastructure needs.
And it has always been so.
John says, I and other Gen Xers have been saying for decades now that we will never be able to retire. We've been expecting to get screwed since we hit the job market. What your students are telling you is that their Gen X parents have been saying. That generational compact broke down back in the 1990s. And then Amy, who says, isn't it true that the very wealthy were taxed at over 50% when the country was prosperous in the decades after World War II? How about we raise taxes on billionaires and repeal Citizens United?
You'd have to change the way that the way that Congress is allowed to raise money for themselves.
Those are the letters that we have at the moment. Anything else that anyone would like to say on this before we move on to a new topic? Hearing nothing, we'll move on to a new topic.
Yeah.
Excellent. Let's go to let's see. I want to talk about
They're not so much fun, Joe.
I know they are, aren't they? They're all good, right? Well, we've been talking about Manchin, so let's get Manchin in here. The Joe Manchin, the conservative West Virginia Democrat who may be flirting with a presidential run, is in a clash with President Biden, and this is over a climate law. The Democrat who faces re-election next year has threatened to repeal the measure that he helped write. Does that make sense? He has professed frustration and dismay at what he calls the radical climate agenda that he says is driving the Biden administration's rollout of the law. Mr. Manchin's poll numbers in his solidly Republican and coal-rich state dropped last year after he played a critical role in writing the climate, health, and tax legislation. He has since worked to rebrand the pro-environment law, telling voters it would not only combat climate change but also ensure fossil fuel production in the United States. The senator, who, as I mentioned, is up for re-election next year, has declared a sort of legislative war against the measure he helped push through Congress. He has professed frustration and dismay at what he calls the radical climate agenda that he says is driving the Biden administration's rollout of the law. And he is still irritated that his colleagues failed to include one of his top priorities, an initiative to stop permitting of energy projects. How do we make Joe Manchin happy?
Well, I mean, he's too
Your
old.
mic isn't on there. You press that blue button. There you go.
I'm sorry. He's too old for this tantrum. I just want to point that out. So, Mama Manchin, if you're still in the world, you may want to talk to your son about growing up. He's. Well, first, I'm struck and I'm struggling, Joe, with this idea that he would be naive enough to think that he's got a shot at being president. I mean, so first, I'm sitting here thinking, why would anybody put money into a Joe Manchin for president campaign? It's this delusional approach that you sort of hear. Mark, you put your finger on it a little bit ago. He's in order for him to have a shot at re-election to the Senate, he's going to have to run to the right because West Virginia has taken a hard turn towards the right. They were bluish purple. You know, you think about Bobby Byrd and sort of some of the more traditional West Virginia Democrats. He's beholden to coal, but honestly, in West Virginia, you're beholden to coal in part because I think it's as much a memory of the legacy than it is actual productivity or profitability. I really do. I think the state has changed an awful lot, and he can be as angry as he wants. He co-authored it. If he wanted something in the bill, he certainly could have pushed it through because he and Sinema were the absolute linchpins. So this idea that he somehow was done wrong by his colleagues plays really, really flat with me.
Theresa?
Yeah, I do think this is really just his pathway to political, what he perceives as his pathway to political survival, and also political relevance. Wants to be in the mix here. But in April 24th, I just checked. That's when he began threatening to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. He was in a interview with Hannity on Fox, and what he said about Biden is that he shouldn't be playing Russian roulette with the debt. The nation's, President Biden can't play Russian roulette with the debt and debt ceiling. That would be disastrous for our economy and for the American people. This is the United States, not the divided states. You've got to get in the room and work out the differences for the sake of our country. Well, I just think he has the wrong name there. I think McCarthy should have been there. But he also talks about energy security and that we need to focus on energy security and not the environment. But I think you just cannot. Those two are one and the same, and that there are a range of pathways to energy security, and it's clear that we need to diversify those range of pathways, and the cost to our country will be pretty extensive. I mean, you've seen it in the storms that we've had and the high costs of storms and so on and so forth. So I just think that we need to get on the same page about the energy transition, that's been talked about here. And certainly fossil fuel, at least in the short term, needs to be part of that energy transition. But we need to be moving away from that. And that includes reducing our energy use, which we have to get at buildings and transportation and all that boring stuff, the details. And, that's why the Infrastructure Act bill was so important to make those kinds of energy efficiency changes. And that I think if he wants to have a real conversation about energy security, doing it over this raising the debt limit is not the way to do it. And eliminating or repealing the Inflation Reduction Act is certainly not the way to do it.
The YouGov and The Economist last October did a survey and asked Americans to rate their views of 72 people. And Joe Manchin received the lowest bipartisan score. That man ain't running for president. What he's doing is he's threatening to run for president because in this as a third party candidate, so he can scare Biden and the Democrats into giving them a win that he needs, because in the wake of his capitulation on the Inflation Reduction Act, he's viewed unfavorably in West Virginia, and he's got to claw himself back into popularity. That's what Joe Manchin is doing.
But that's about as effective as clawing back the COVID relief money.
Well,
it's baked in, and I'm sorry.
He's got to notch some win. I'm not here to defend Joe Manchin, but he's going to have to stand on a hill of some victory and point it out to his constituencies in hope of burnishing his chances of reelection.
And that's part of Biden's team's job, to figure out what's the win that they can give him. But the win for West Virginia is to not dismantle the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure money, because I think if you start looking at what are the investments in there, so many of the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act are targeted to places like West Virginia that in a disproportionate way to make the energy transition. Right?
It's just fascinating the amount of money, if you think about where federal spending occurs. Places like Kentucky, places like West Virginia, places like Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, they receive more of our money. I mean, you want to talk about socialism and redistribution of wealth, right. and it doesn't get recognized. Another thought that popped into my head, and I don't know if we're going to get to the article about North Carolina, but I'll toss it out, is that I find it really interesting, too, at the same time we're talking about more work requirements on people, struggling to survive. With the changes in the abortion laws and the fact that we've removed so many reproductive rights from women that they're being forced into carrying pregnancies to term, what happens then? I mean, what happens?
Take away all these supports.
Exactly, you're taking away. One hand, you're sitting on this position about abortion, saying that six weeks or 12 weeks and
before most people know they're pregnant.
Right. But then there's no support once a baby is born, no support for the family. And I mean, that's got to be part of the conversation that's linked with all of this that we're talking about.
Yeah, the concern is primarily from conception to birth, and after that, you're on your own.
All right. Hold that thought. We'll be back. We want to get to your letters. Panel at WAMC.org. We'll return right after this. Good morning. Welcome back to the Roundtable and to our panel discussion this morning. Alan Chartock, Theresa Bourgeois, Bob Griffin, and Mark Wittman make up our group. They'll be with us for another 15 minutes or so.
And Joe, I just want to note, it's a much happier Mark Whitman than he started, too.
Yeah, he's less surly, I think.
He's fired up. He's ready to go.
Yeah, he's a little slumped in his chair. But I forget, I didn't thank Mark because for the second appearance in a row, he brought us donuts, which is just lovely.
That's very nice.
It's very, very nice.
I was up late making those.
Yeah, they're really, really good. They're so beautiful. I got over it. You feel like, oh my God, I can't eat these.
Well, I looked at them; they were too pretty. I wasn't going to take one. I didn't want to be the first to take something that pretty.
We thank you.
So we don't know why you were surly coming in this morning. You feeling better now?
This show always makes me a little happier.
Yeah.
Because it's so upbeat.
I think everyone can say that.
We just watched Mark's nose grow.
That's not true. I love this, and I tell you, I come home some days, and my wife listens to it sometimes when it's live. You say, "Oh my gosh, you and Theresa." I'm like, "No, we get along marvelously."
I love being
the fact
on
that
with Mark.
I think this show is a great example of exchanging ideas, sometimes opposing ideas, in a animated way, but that shows you could respect those you're conversing with.
I think I can say this with full truth, that in all the years that we've been doing this, no one has left the building, has left this room in a funk or angry or ticked off at another person more than 4 or 5 times.
There used to be a show called the McLaughlin Group. Remember that? With it, so that people with different views. John McLaughlin would be the moderator and sit around and talk about issues. And back in the day,
Germond.
And it was this heated debate from people from all different views. So Friday nights, I had a group of people. We would get together, all different political backgrounds, views, whatever, and dinner and a McLaughlin group. Issue. Literally, somebody would say issue 1, and we discuss it. But
issue 1.
Issue
no.
1.
Yes.
And we'd have these heated arguments, but then, we were great friends and we'd all leave. But it was a great way to learn, to really think through the details of these different
Jesuit
topics.
or Franciscan?
Jesuit.
Yeah. He was a Jesuit, was studying to be a Jesuit priest.
Yeah, Jesuit.
Yeah. All right, let's go.
Not me, that was
that was John McLaughlin, the dearly departed John McLaughlin. All right, let's go to...
But I love being on with you guys. It's good fun. Sorry. That was the point of that whole thing.
to your John McLaughlins. Yeah. Let's go to other topics. And
can we say as a quick aside, Philadelphia, the Democrats won. Yahoo! I know that's not the story we're going to, but wow.
Jacksonville and Kentucky too, if we're going to talk elections.
Yeah.
Anyway,
some interesting election news. Didn't we think? I mean, I'm from Philadelphia, but it seemed.
Did you think that
the Democrat was going to win? Yes.
Okay. Not as many. I mean, to hold the seat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Are we talking about the mayoral? We're talking
Yeah.
about I thought that was actually a pretty interesting.
I was talking about the statewide election.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm talking mayoral. Why don't we do mayoral first? Because certainly, if you look what happened in Chicago, where the progressive candidate beat the law enforcement, the public safety law enforcement candidate. In Philly, it was the progressive candidate who got a lot of support from, I think, AOC, and Bernie did not win. It was more that we need to do something about crime and bring back safety to our streets. And I think that's an important lesson for 2024.
Sherelle Parker.
Yeah.
Defeated the conservative candidate.
Well, there were 5 or 6 of them, weren't there?
But Democrats outnumber Republicans 7-1 in Philadelphia. So we now believe that, I think rightfully so, that she will probably go on to be the 100th mayor of the city of brotherly love.
First one.
Yes, in all of those years. Served for 10 years as a state representative for Northwest Philadelphia before her election to the city council in 2015. The nation's 6th largest city, and will go up against Republican David O. in the November 7th general election. All right. So let's go to and to Mark's point real quick. Defeated a field. Jim Kenney. It's Rebecca Reinhart, Alan Jim, Alan Dome, Jeff Brown, Eamon Brown, James DeLeon, Delsha Gray, and Warren Bloom. So it was a crowded field.
Yes, it was.
All right. Let's talk about new North Carolina real quick and about what is going on there. North Carolina's Republican-dominated legislature upheld a bill Tuesday night that will ban most abortions after 12 weeks, overriding the Democratic governor's recent veto of the new restrictions. The success of the override was a victory for Republicans and a critical test of their new but slim supermajority. The vote taken in both chambers and back-to-back sessions means a dramatic change for abortion access in North Carolina, where abortion is currently legal up to 20 weeks. The vote also restricts access for women across the South, some of whom have traveled to North Carolina for abortions from states where the procedure is largely banned. The new law will take effect July 1st. Bob?
I just, I don't even know where to begin. This one is has so many different twists in it. I mean, first, let's talk about some context. They had someone who was elected as a Democrat pro-choice candidate who switched parties and gave the Republicans their supermajority, and someone who had voted in the past for abortion rights supported this really draconian law, which I just have real heartburn with when somebody's elected on, based on what they said they were going to do, and then they suddenly change and become something very different. That it's a sort of I rebel against the George Santo effect, I guess. It's draconian. It's North Carolina is another example of a gerrymandered state that over the past couple of decades has made it so the urban areas and the growing tech areas down in North Carolina are underrepresented, and it's owned by the rural conservative party, and that's what you're starting to see. What's happening in North Carolina doesn't reflect the population in North Carolina, and this is a real problem for democracy. In addition, I see article after article after article about the potential and significant health impacts that these draconian bans on choice have.
Theresa.
Yeah, I think the focus is all on the politics of this, the winners and the losers, and a lot of it is distorted by gerrymandering, and it's easy to lose sight of the impact that this will have on people, often in very difficult circumstances, and I think we have to acknowledge there are a group of people who deeply believe that abortion is, murder and killing folks and stuff, and killing, not folks, killing children, and so they have those fiercely held beliefs, but these are really medical decisions, often very, very complex medical decisions, and should be left to a doctor. But now it's mostly left to courts and politics, and I think in the end it's going to be elections that decide whether or not this holds or not at the federal level. But in the meantime, I think that there are a lot of individual people who their lives are going to be traumatized by these kinds of political decisions.
Mark?
It seems to me the only reason the Supreme Court
Okay, we got about a minute. Go ahead.
decided this the way they did is because if you look at the constituency this affects most, it's sort of it's a rotating group, right, of mostly younger and middle-aged women. So the Supreme Court got away with this because of who that group is in a way they couldn't with any other group. The other thing I'd say about this is, I think over time, the importance of this as a wedge issue will only increase. I mean, this animates the base, it attracts moderates, and it leaves many conservatives at odds with their own party, and that's only going to get worse for that party.
You, sir, get the last